Lauri is going to be back in Utah per reports and will be eligible to stay in the Utah Jazz organization and not be traded for an entire year. So fret not. What does that mean? And what is next for the Jazz? Find out next from Andy Larsen and I on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin with you here on a big day for the Utah Jazz. You guys know me by now, but if you're new and listening because you hear the news about Lauri Markkanen and you don't know me, I'm Leif Thulin. I'm excited, as always, to fill in for David Locked On Jazz. I'm a lifelong Jazz fan, credentialed NBA draft analyst for the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, attendee of both the 2023 and 2024 NBA Combine, Jazz broadcast assistant and statistician the past 3 seasons, lover of all things hoops, college basketball, high school ranks, everything basketball, and don't expect all the geeky numbers that David brings to the table to be gone because, like I said, I do stats, and I'll tell you about a lot about the new guys, the Cody Williams, the guys that could be coming up this next year for the Jazz, and because I watch way too much basketball, and I'm excited to share those thoughts with you guys. So thank you guys for making Locked On Jazz your first listen each and every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is to comment anything below. And today's question is, how do you feel about the rumored deal for Lauri? What number do you think would have been appropriate? Anything of that genre, I will get back to you guys, and I'm excited to hear your guys' thoughts because, like you guys, I am a diehard Jazz fan. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. And today I'm so lucky to be joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune, excellent beat writer. You guys know his work, but he's also going to break down this trade in live. Andy was kind enough to join me, and we made this work pretty quickly. And I'm thrilled because as I was going through it, I kind of had nothing new to tell you that based on what I've been telling you guys for the past couple of months. So I'm thrilled to have an extra perspective, and thank you for joining, Andy.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
Of course. It's always a pleasure. So in the first segment, we're probably going to just break down the probable deal, rumored price tag, intricacies of the supposed deal. Second segment, for those of you listening, we're going to talk about why the trades for the Warriors, the Spurs, and the Kings for Lauri didn't work, why the Jazz were reluctant to consider those and ultimately decided against it. And then in the third segment, what's next for the Jazz? That's where my brain goes as a Jazz fan. I felt like this was a foregone conclusion a couple weeks ago. I think many of you guys felt the same. So what is the next step for the Jazz, ultimately leading to contending? So let's dive right in. So I'll read what I read this morning. I literally opened my eyes, looked at my phone. I had an alert about the Jazz. And if you guys are like me, that gets you going both with fear, adrenaline, everything there. I was thrilled. And I kind of knew what it was going to be about. I knew it was August 6th, but I opened my eyes, sleep deprived and all. And I was like, Jazz notification, let's go. It read as follows. Markkanen and the Utah Jazz are expected to agree to a massive long-term contract extension planned to be signed Wednesday or later, making him ineligible to be traded for the entire 2024-2025 season, league sources tell The Athletic. That's what I woke up to. Not entirely stunning, but that's great. Great news for the Jazz that he factors into the long-term equation, which makes the Jazz choose a pathway to contend or tank. And as many Jazz fans who saw this news are probably happy to see a player who loves Utah's home come back, but are nervous that this player prevents the Jazz from getting the likes of Cooper Flagg. That's kind of what I think. I think that's what they think. What are your thoughts as someone who covers the team? And though you are from Utah, and I believe you grew up a diehard Jazz fan as well, you have more professional obligations than I do. What are your thoughts on this matter?
Yeah, look, but it's still a good deal for the Jazz. I think for decades now, since really Stockton Malone, the question is, can the Jazz get a star who wants to stay in Utah, right? And I think that was a question with Donovan Mitchell. That was a question with Gordon Hayward. I think Rudy Gobert would have stayed in Utah had he kind of been able to and showed that with the course of his multiple contract extensions. And Lauri Markkanen is one of those guys who wants to stay in Utah, right? And was an all-star starter a year and a half ago and is probably one of the top 20 to 25 guys in the NBA. To not only have that player kind of already in a Jazz uniform, but wanting to keep his future in Utah, not only just to be traded, and I think he probably could have gotten more money had he signed one day earlier. Now he wants to instead spend more time here in Utah to play with the Jazz, to believe in this front office group a little bit to put talent around him, I think says a lot about who Lauri is and what his priorities are. And I think for, again, a fan base that has been through so much, stars want to play in Utah conversation, to have someone so willingly, so quickly make it harder for him to leave Utah is really encouraging to hear.
Yeah, and like I said, the only conflict I felt when seeing that and the money label of what the estimations are, and we'll get to that, is how likely is it the Jazz can be bad enough to get one of these stars, and how quickly can the turnaround happen if you're putting that much money to someone? But I'm thrilled because you actually get a player who wants to be in Utah and you have this long-term contract. Like when I read that and it said long-term contract extension, it makes me so happy to hear. For the Jazz fans not quite aware, can you specify the difference between if Lauri had signed prior to August 6th versus signing after August 6th? And I've read a lot about it, but maybe some haven't. Can you clarify it for those who are not aware?
Yeah, so the rule is if you sign a renegotiation, an extension like Lauri is doing, you can't be traded for 6 months, and exactly 6 months. And 6 months from August 6th, which is Tuesday, would be exactly February 6th, which is exactly the NBA's trade deadline, which would have given the Jazz only that one day to trade him. Now, because he is delaying the signature until either Wednesday or moving forward, it's not clear yet from the Athletic report. That means that he won't be eligible to be traded before this year's trade deadline. And in short, wouldn't be able to be traded until the Jazz's season is over. And so that means kind of 8 months of peace for him, I think, and 8 months of peace for Jazz fans who, obviously you're not, it's never that much fun to have your best player's name in trade conversations, in rumors all the time. And I think that gives kind of them and Lauri a little bit of peace of mind for the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. And I think it should give Jazz fans an ease of mind, like you said. So now let's talk about what eases Lauri Markkanen's mind. The money that he got is unbelievable. It's not set in stone, but the article that I referenced earlier that broke the news suggests Markkanen's deal is projected to be worth upwards of 200 million over 5 years. For those of you wanting the math on that, that means it's 40 mil for 5 years, basically. 200 could be higher, could be a touch lower. That would keep him under contract at 2029, giving him the richest contract in Jazz history. I was doing some digging, and one of the highest salaries ever for a European player in NBA history. Is there any other financial side that you've heard about or ramification that I did not mention there?
Yeah, so his couple things. So his full max would have been 232 million. And so referencing the article references a salary upwards of 200 million. So kind of looking in that 200 to 232 range, indicates that next year, the 2024 part of the deal will be his maximum at about 42 million. And that makes sense, right? Like if you are going to choose a time to save some money on that compared to the max, would be down the road when you want to add future better players, when the Jazz could be a contending team 2027, 28, 29, hopefully, right? So I think that's kind of the goal there. It also gives them immediately to the salary cap floor, which is obviously something that they wanted to do in order to keep some of their options open that way under the new salary floor rules. And overall, because the salary cap figures to go up about 10% per year for the next 3, 4, 5 years because of this new NBA TV revenue money, that $40 million a year seems like a lot of money. Certainly right now, it's about 30% of the salary cap. That number should decline a little bit moving forward. And again, giving the Jazz just a little bit more flexibility to add other pieces to the roster.
Yeah, and I think that's a vital clarification at the end there. Speaking of the way that, I mean, inflation's happening all around the world, but it's happening in the NBA too. For people to understand from a different perspective, Lauri getting paid 40 million is not getting paid 40 million the same way that it was such a destructive contract for teams even 4 or 5 years ago. So coming up next, we're going to have more Markkanen talk, how it happened, like what trades did not happen that kept Lauri here. Talk about how the Jazz can get to the promised land. The conference finals haven't been attained since I was 7 years old. And I want nothing more than getting to that land. So we're going to talk about how that can happen, what happened along this process, and much, much more. But first, let me tell you guys about Gametime. So, have you guys ever been to an MLB game? That's the season right now. It's baseball season. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of the MLB, which makes getting regular season and playoff tickets even faster and even easier. Prices on Gametime actually go down the closer it gets to tip off. It could be basketball, it could be baseball, it could be anything. And you want to go to this game and it's all sold out. Rarely the issue here. In fact, you'll get better deals. They also have killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets, and they have great and easy to find MLB tickets for every or just any kind of event in your area. And for instance, I just bought tickets to the US Open using Gametime, and I made sure to peruse the views from my seats in the venue with panoramic views, allowing me to see the best view of the action where the best players in the world will be taking stage in the Big Apple. And the best part, the lowest price guarantee does factor in. And if they don't have something like that, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets, MLB tickets, any of the above on Gametime. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And I also want to tell you guys about Murdoch Hyundai. Murdoch Hyundai, they've been all over Utah, and it's a stamp of approval everywhere you go. Murdoch Hyundai's got the best car for your money, safety features, bells, whistles, and all, and amazing cars and prices. It's a no-brainer. The SUV lineup features the Kona, the Tucson, the Santa Fe, the Palisade. I've ridden in the Tucson many times, and I've driven it a few times, and it's got all the bells, safety features that you could ask for. Sometimes you're so safe that it's almost alarming after driving another car, because you'll put the blinker on and it'll tell you if someone's there, and you're like, wow, that saved me. You always are covered there. The Ioniq 5 electric was named the Motor Trend SUV of the year by Motor Trend. The new Ioniq 6 is even better. Electric, looks like a Porsche, and just won the World Car of the Year. There are 3 locations in Linden, Murray, and Logan. I can personally tell you how great the people are in Murray. And I went there once, and they were like, hey, do you do Locked On Jazz? And I was appalled, but that was awesome. So I was thrilled to see that, and hope they continue the great work, and hope you guys take your car needs to Murdoch Hyundai. Welcome back to Locked On Jazz, and I've got one last question of you guys. Are you guys watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of your Locked On podcast network, your team every day. Welcome back. I'm Leif Thulin, joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune, kind enough to take time out of his day to talk about Lauri Markkanen about to sign a huge contract extension and what it means for the Jazz. So before the break, I referenced I was 7 years old the last time the Jazz made the conference finals. There's nothing I want more than to see the Jazz reach that level again and hopefully maintain it. The West is really good. Lauri Markkanen helps the Jazz. But if there's anyone like me who's a draft nerd and sees, oh, there's Cooper Flagg, there's all these guys, what can you tell them about Lauri Markkanen's level of patience? He hasn't made a playoff. There's been questions about, well, would he be willing to stay if the Jazz are considering trying to tank and get the level of a player like Cooper Flagg? Can you ease the tension of Jazz fans like myself who are concerned about that question?
Yeah, look, I mean, Lauri in his post-season press conference said, and I quote, I know how the business works. They have to make those tough decisions. I think we have a lot of good people in this organization that have shown that they can do the job. I have trust for those guys. And I think it's pretty clear that he, by signing this deal, does trust the front office to get better, that he does want to see improvement. Certainly, I think some of that can come from within, but also some of it can come from what this front office brings him over the next, again, 5 years. So, I think it is an interesting part of these talks, as I'm sure Lauri obviously is a very competitive human being, wants to be in the playoffs, wants to be contending for titles. And while this Jazz team is very far away from that right now, he thinks that there is a path that they've been able to sell him on that kind of gets him to be able to achieve his career goals too.
Yeah, and that's reassuring for myself and many other Jazz fans, I'm sure. For those of you listening to this, the everydayers on Locked On Jazz, David Locke, right before I took over this week, mentioned that he believes 15 of 18 teams who have done what he called a complete tank job, comprising of 2 or 3 years. 15 of those 18 teams have had success, at least moderately, making the playoffs in a short proximity after that tank job. So that would lead me to believe that the Jazz need to follow that route. I've also been vocal about that being the best pathway to contending for quite some time. In fact, I've expressed to Andy in the hallways of Jazz games that I was frustrated 2 years ago when the Jazz started off 10-3 because Victor Wembanyama is an unbelievable prospect. I don't even think Cooper Flagg, who's getting rave reviews, teams are shifting their season's plans to up their way into the sweepstakes of getting Cooper Flagg. And I was frustrated that Wembanyama was unattainable starting 10-3. So I voiced that concern. I look at the NBA this year, and I say all that to say this: the Jazz, even with Markkanen, I think are going to be at best 13th in the West, probably 14th. It's the Jazz and the Blazers are the two worst teams. The Grizzlies got better. The Rockets were already 500. The Spurs have Wemby, the aforementioned alien that is Wembanyama, CP3, Barnes, Castle, all those guys joined. Then there's the East. There's Detroit, Washington, Charlotte, Brooklyn, Toronto, potentially Atlanta and Chicago. So those are like 7 teams right there. What do you think the landscape of the NBA is, and how does it align for the Jazz to get into the sweepstakes of this awesome draft?
Look, I think obviously the Western Conference, the Jazz aren't likely to be competitive in it. The Jazz's problem is that the Eastern Conference has a number of those tanking teams, right? And whether you look at Chicago or Brooklyn, Atlanta is certainly a question mark. I mean, you can kind of Washington, obviously, you can kind of go down the list. And so, right now, I believe the Vegas odds put the Jazz as having the 8th worst record in the NBA. Which obviously doesn't get it done from a top tier draft prospect point of view. So something's got to change there. And either, you go out and acquire a good player, or you go out and get rid of some of your other good players now that you've re-signed Lauri Markkanen, right? Like, frankly, the other guy that was significantly above replacement level last year was Colin Sexton. And can you move Colin Sexton if you do want to tank? Or do you not play him? I mean, there are real questions. Can you sit Lauri for half the season? Can you sit Colin for half the season? How many games can you win or lose if you do that? But yeah, I mean, I think that it's fair to say that there are real questions. I mean, look, you talked about the Victor Wembanyama year and the Jazz starting 10-3. I remember, even though there was elation and surprise and happiness when that was happening, I remember talking to Ryan Smith at that point, and he was kind of cautious in his optimism, right? Like he knew that this was a bad thing kind of for the future and not necessarily good for the franchise, because it did mean that they missed out on a generational prospect. And so I think that this front office understands what they're dealing with. Like, I don't think that the goal is to be the 8th pick in the draft for every year from here on out. And that they will probably have to make some changes to avoid that. But that being said, they haven't to this point, and I think that's fair to say there are real questions as to what they'll be able to do in order to actually make that happen over the next 12 months.
Yeah, and I think the Jazz, everyone's talks about, well, they have such a luxury of picks and they have all these guys. Well, eventually it has to become players that contribute to winning, and I understand I'm all for the patience, but patience wanes for fans, patience wanes for presidents, owners, GMs, all this stuff. So speaking of the general managers, they had a difficult decision to make about Lauri Markkanen regarding whether to trade him or not. Obviously, it looks like it's not going to happen. The Jazz feel relieved about that. But can you take me through kind of the teams that had offers, namely the Warriors, and then why it did not happen? Just because I think it's a valuable insight for Jazz fans to know, like, look, these are the discussions that were had, and this is how highly the Jazz regard Lauri Markkanen to keep him here, because there were some serious packages on the table.
I think there were serious packages, but I don't think that there were any kind of the value that teams have gotten for stars over the last 3 to 4 years. There wasn't that James Harden package, there wasn't the Mikal Bridges package, there wasn't a Donovan and Rudy package out there, and part of that's just how the marketplace has worked out, where those buyers have already kind of used those picks already. Like right, like the Phoenix Suns already used all their picks for Kevin Durant, and the Knicks used all their picks for Bridges, and you kind of go down the list, and there are only a few teams left with real significant draft capital, of which the Warriors are not really one of them. They're able to trade 2.5 real picks and then pick swaps, and then would have been able to add, say, a Brandon Podziemski or Jonathan Kuminga to that deal, which, according to reporting of Shams Charania, they did not. And so even if they had, I think you're really looking at kind of a 50-50 kind of valuation offer, where those picks don't look brilliant anyway, especially if you give them Lauri Markkanen. And then, I really like Pods as a player, but he doesn't necessarily have future all-star kind of written all over him, right? Like, he's a late first-round pick who popped last year. So, I think it's fair to question kind of where the upside on this roster comes from. And the Jazz's picks from Cleveland and Minnesota don't look that good at this point, because those teams have built relatively well and had really good seasons last year. So, really interesting to see how that plays out. But yeah, there are no great answers for the Jazz right now, and it is a tough situation they find themselves in.
Yeah, and it's frustrating to feel like there's a precipice of, well, this is what we value this player as, and now we just paid north of $200 million for him, and that's what the NBA values him as. But it's a marketplace. It's not necessarily a one-to-one scale, but it does beg the question of, like we tried to address it earlier, is Colin Sexton on the marketplace? Is the trade block? Is Walker Kessler heading somewhere? Are the Jazz going to try to find someone to supplement the roster with and try to contend sooner rather than later? So we'll discuss all of that coming up next. But first, a word from eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and pay. Now a word from eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your fit is guaranteed to fit your part is guaranteed to fit your ride. Every time you're looking for, eBay Motors has you covered. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride, as I just said, every time, or your money is coming back guaranteed. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All righty, final segment here on Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin, joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune. And the question now becomes, the Jazz have Lauri Markkanen. Now, what other players are going to be here other than the rookies and the second-year players? So I'll turn it over as simply as that. I mean, you mentioned, do the Jazz keep a guy who's over replacement level in Colin Sexton? Obviously, Jordan Clarkson and John Collins were often mentioned in rumors because they were not people the Jazz prioritized on having on the roster entering this season. So what's next for the players that are currently on the Jazz's roster, and what would the trades look like to change the roster?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think every veteran player that's not named Lauri Markkanen is on the trade market for the Jazz. And I think that's kind of a bummer of reality, but I think that is the reality, is that this team is looking for a new direction. And while they'd like to keep Lauri, he is an exception because of how productive he is. That being said, the players that the Jazz do have to trade are kind of not in the NBA zeitgeist right now, where, the NBA is looking for big switchable wings who can contribute on both ends of the floor. And Colin Sexton, Jordan Clarkson, and John Collins are not that. And really showed that last year, especially Clarkson and Collins, that frankly, again, they played at near replacement level levels. And, certainly John Collins had a lot of points and rebounds, and that's great. And then you look at the efficiency and especially the defense numbers, the plus minus numbers, and they were really, really negative. And so that's troubling. And again, Jordan Clarkson, among qualifying players with enough minutes, had the second worst effective field goal percentage in the league last year at the age above 30. So look, there aren't going to be suitors for those guys necessarily that make a lot of sense. There hasn't been interest in the trade market for them. What you would need to do if you wanted to move on is attach something else of value, i.e. one of the Jazz's young players or Walker Kessler or a pick. And I think given where the Jazz are right now, it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to do that. You might as well just eat the bad contracts, the earlier decisions that you've made. So that makes it a really tricky situation where selling the veteran guys you have now doesn't make a ton of sense unless you're able to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And then buying players is tricky too, because you're not really a contending team unless you get a really terrific player, right? Like, there have been Brandon Ingram rumors, and how good of a team are the Jazz with Ingram and Markkanen? Best case, I think they're about as good as the Pelicans were last year, right? Which was a really quick first round exit. So I don't know that, they have found themselves, again, kind of in between a rock and a hard place here. I do expect them to try to make moves over the next couple of months, and maybe something does come up where a contending team decides, hey, it would be nice to have Jordan Clarkson scoring off the bench. But for right now, the analytically oriented front offices are going to look at the numbers from last year and just think, I can do better with a cheaper contract somewhere else. And it's hard to really disagree with that point of view.
Yeah, I was going to ask about Brandon Ingram just today. I saw rumored on Bleacher Report that Brandon Ingram and the Jazz are one of the teams to monitor, and it would be around Walker Kessler. And I thought to myself, look, Brandon Ingram's a really good player, and he's almost viewed as a reclamation project right now just because he wasn't good enough to be the man in New Orleans when Zion Williamson was healthy. And then they have Trey Murphy and Herb Jones. And so more often than not, I'd be thrilled. I could talk myself into it. But the Jazz have picked their direction. They've chosen Lauri Markkanen as the star right now, and they're hoping to get themselves a Class A Tier 1 star through the draft in one of these next two star-studded drafts. So it just seems like that would be trying to fit too many things into one direction. And that's been my complaint. I mentioned it a little bit earlier here, is the Jazz have drafted 9th and 10th the last 2 years. And 10th, I almost think, was more frustrating than 9th, because 9th, at least you started with Mike Conley. You started with a few other good players, and you started 10-3, and you didn't know that was going to happen. And like I said, this is not hindsight. I was frustrated. The day they went to 10-3, the best record in the NBA, I was in the tunnels annoyed. And I was like, I love watching my team win, but you got to think about Victor Wembanyama. Last year, we all know how it went. The Jazz were well below 500, ended up 500 through 52 games, then ended up with the worst record in the entire NBA for the final 30. And so I think this year the Jazz have made their bed and they're going to lie in it. It's not going to be we've done this, maybe we can try this. I think there's a clear direction. And so though the Jazz are linked in rumors, it's fun to see. I don't think any Jazz fans should really see themselves as contenders to trade for a Brandon Ingram. If anything, I think the Jazz will be sellers at this point. But I don't see many teams liking the contract for John Collins, liking the contract, even though Clarkson's contract's not terrible. Like you said, his efficiency wasn't great, and he's over 30 years old. So the Jazz just have to find a way to manage their way into the top 5 in the draft. And that'll be interesting to see. And it's almost reverse thinking. You don't like to think that way, but I think that's the reality of the way the NBA is shifting this year. I heard from a good source who knows people in Team USA that Cooper Flagg performance shifted the agendas of teams just by watching him compete against NBA athletes. And that should speak to why there needs to be a direction that's clear cut and has no deviations this year.
Yeah, because he looked like he belonged. And, I think he's obviously the best prospect in this draft, but there are multiple other guys, kind of almost unlike the Wembanyama draft, where, I think the 4th or 5th pick in the Wembanyama draft gets you in Amen Thompson and I think the prospect you project to get in the 2025 draft would be significantly better. I suspect that, there certainly are multiple teams that are chasing Cooper Flagg in the top of that draft. If the Jazz are going to be one of those teams, they need to find pretty sneaky ways to start losing games. And that means, frankly, sitting Lauri if he's healthy. That means sitting Colin Sexton even though he's healthy. But they've already done that the last 2 years. And, frankly, those guys are not happy about it, right? Like they want to play basketball. They want to improve. They want to show their skills and not waste years of their athletic primes so that the Jazz can draft a potentially better replacement for them, right? Like that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so how exactly that works out. And I think Will Hardy has shown that he's a good coach who can get wins out of kind of losing talent a little bit, right? We saw that, I think, 2 years ago, and I think we saw that at the beginning of last year. So it's a really tricky situation, again, that they find themselves in. I think Brandon Ingram, on the buy side of things, makes some sense just because he is low value in the trade market. But I also think that among stars you could put Lauri Markkanen next to, I think he's the worst I can imagine, because you want someone with some playmaking ability. You want someone with some creation for others. And that's not Brandon Ingram right now. And so I think ultimately it is just a tough situation that I think they're hoping time and chaos kind of helps them find their way out of. But for right now, they're not one of the better situated teams in the NBA, unfortunately.
Let me ask one final question regarding the best way to lose games. And I think this could also be long-term beneficial, is how much do the rookies play? And last year, for example, we saw the Spurs would make their runs when Wembanyama was on the floor, but they'd strategically not play him for large portions of the game, as opposed to kind of those, oh, Rudy's going to play the first rotation, the first stint, then he's going to come back and play the third, and then the fourth stint, and they found a way to the normal minutes. Wembanyama's were clear-cut. It was Wembanyama plays, Wembanyama sits, Wembanyama plays, Wembanyama sits. Is there a way the Jazz can do that with Markkanen, and/or is there a way that the Jazz can just play enough of those 6 guys who are 20 years or younger on their roster to find their way into losing games, even if it coincides with the playing time of Colin Sexton and Lauri Markkanen both playing? It's just too hard to win with that much youth.
Look, if they were I think theoretically they could do that. Essentially, I think playing Keontae and Taylor and Isaiah Collier together would be enough, right? Like, and then you can play Lauri next to them, and you're just not going to be very good. But everything we know about how Will Hardy has structured his rotations and how he brings along young players has been the exact opposite of that. Has been to wait to, literally putting Taylor Hendricks, your lottery pick, in the G League, and to bring Keontae George slowly, even at the expense of starting a Taylor Horton-Tucker, who is one of the worst Jazz players to ever play basketball. I mean, so I don't think that, if they are able to do that, if that is their plan for tanking, is to play the young guys, that will be just a significant change in character and franchise, or I guess at least coaching philosophy, than what we've seen over the last couple of years. And so for those reasons, I'm kind of skeptical that ends up what happens, right? Like, I think they play a lot of Drew Eubanks this year, for example, right? And I think probably the better thing for tanking and for the future of the Jazz would be to play Kyle Filipowski. But I just, again, that's not who Will Hardy has shown himself to be as a coach, and not what the Jazz have shown themselves to do over the course at least of 82 games. They've certainly tanked the final month of a season. It would be, again, surprising to see them do that for the entire year.
Do you see any deviation from that pattern earlier this year? I'm not saying the entire 82, but with the Cooper Flagg agenda of so many teams share, and the Jazz having 6 players 20 years of age or younger, do you see that pattern not staying the same? Ochai Agbaji was 22, sat in the G League for a while. You saw Hendricks do it. Do you see Cody Williams from day one play all 82 games in the NBA? Is that a likelihood?
I mean, I don't think it's likely, but I think it's possible, right? Like, Keontae George was in the NBA all season long. And I think, frankly, Cody Williams is a better basketball player now than I think Taylor Hendricks is now. And that's that's fine. That's, kind of the deal with the NBA draft. I don't think that means I think Cody Williams is going to be like a 5-win player in his rookie year, right? But I think he's a little bit more ready. Look, we could see them prioritize the youth earlier, and I think that would make sense. Frankly, what I think is maybe more likely is that they milk the Lauri shoulder injury to last longer and maybe get out his first month of the year. But that's speculation, right? I truly don't know what they have in store. But the need to do something in either direction is so clear and so severe that, yeah, you could see some weird stuff happening like that.
Well, we went all over the map. I appreciate it all the same, Andy, and thank you for jumping on. It's been a pleasure. And Jazz fans, there's going to be some pen coming to paper soon for Lauri Markkanen, so get excited about that. Read it with Andy on Salt Lake Tribune and all the other great beat writers that cover the Jazz so brilliantly for us to glean all the knowledge we have. So thank you for joining us on Locked On Jazz. And for those of you wanting to see David Locke, when Lauri does sign with the Utah Jazz, he'll be breaking it down in perspectives maybe Andy and I have not. So look forward to that. Look forward to Lauri signing for the Jazz. And once again, we like to ask you guys to look into Locked On, which has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On. Plus, our national shows covering every single league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. So thank you for making Locked On Jazz your first to listen. With your next, check out Locked On NBA for the latest breakdowns of the NBA, maybe the Olympics and more. And as always, thank you guys for listening, and go Jazz.